While we get, wait to get started, I'm just gonna wait about a minute and a half or so, for everyone who's interested in joining to join in. So, hopefully that can, you know, once we know that, everyone who'd like to attend really is on, we can get started. In the meantime, I just want to familiarize all of you with some of the sort of best practices for how we'll be conducting this webinar. Ideally, we want to have a strategy that ensures that the overall approach that we take is efficient, right? Because ultimately we all have limited time, and I'm sure that some of you are taking time out of your lives. You could be doing other things. It is a Friday night. So, props to all of you for coming on, and, hopefully we can conduct this session in the most effective way possible. So a few, sort of ground rules. We're trying to be as efficient as possible. So, all of what we're gonna try to, all of the rules that we're gonna have in place are in service of making a strategy, the meeting go by as efficiently as possible. So there are a couple of ways that you can get in touch with me, or rather that you can sort of say what you would like to say. So you may have noticed that there's a chat window, there is a Q&A window, right? So you can ask your questions, and there is a raise hand function. So firstly, I would like to say that we're not going to be using the raise hand function. It's just based on how we try to conduct things. It doesn't seem to work out very efficiently. Now, if you have any questions of me, you can ask them in the Q&A section or in the chat section. I don't really mind. I believe that if you ask it in the Q&A section, everyone else cannot see your question. So, that could be good if you want to ask something anonymously, and, obviously then I won't reveal, your name when I, go over the questions. So how we'll be doing this is that at various intervals, I will, stop what I'm saying, right? I'll stop and, attend to all of the questions that have come up in that time. So I won't be stopping on the fly as much as possible, because, that kind of breaks the rhythm for everyone in this session as well. So I'll stop at various intervals, and, you can then you can ask your questions in that time. You can ask your question before as well, but if it's something that I cover already, then I probably won't go back to that. If you find that you're experiencing a lag, or you're not able to hear me clearly, or you find that there's some technical issue, I'd like you to ping me on the chat window, not on the Q&A section. When this happens, I will do a brief test of whether other people are facing the problem or not. So, I'll ask you all, is the chat working? Are you able to hear me clearly? Or whatever the question is. And if, your answer is yes, please type in 1. If your answer is no, please type in 2. If enough of you answer, then I'll have, a general sense of whether the technical issue is from our end or from yours. Sounds good? I see that a few questions have come in, so I'll use this as the first opportunity to, ask some questions. So somebody says that they have a few questions. Will we have a Q&A session? It's a good question. Essentially, what I'm hoping for is for this webinar to be done within an hour. And at the end of that, we can have about 15 to 20 minutes of questions. I'd like to put a hard stop on this by 9 o'clock, right? So, just keep that in mind. But I am happy to take questions until then. And, if we get done with the content itself quicker, we can move forward into asking, into other questions. That being said, I would like for you to keep your questions related to the topic at hand. Like, I know that, you might be worried about sentence correction, or, the AWA might be something that you have your concerns about. But, for the benefit of everyone on this webinar, I would like for you to try to keep your questions to something that is, directly related to the topic at hand. All right. So I see that a couple of people are saying that my voice is breaking. That seems a little bit unfortunate. If you can hear me clearly, please type in 1. If you can't hear me clearly, type in 2. Okay, I see a lot of ones coming in. 1, 2. Somebody sent in a 12. I don't know how to interpret that. That's interesting. But okay, so I do think that, it's over 90% of you seem to have no problems whatsoever. So I think that for those of you who aren't able to hear me clearly, I think there may be something that you want to check out on your end. That there may be something that you gotta sort of work out to see if there's a technical issue on your end. I do want to say as well that we're accustomed to having 50 to 80 people for most webinars, sometimes fewer. But at this point, we have 116 people besides myself. So, that's quite impressive. I'm pretty psyched about that. I think, we should get good energy, good interaction going. But that does also mean that we're going to have to be extra organized in order to ensure that we can get everything done, sort of effectively, and that, we don't just veer off track completely. I do see a couple more of you are saying that my voice is breaking. However, I do think that it is a small enough number that this is probably something that you might want to look at your end. And I've tried to turn the fans down to, a low speed, both for the room and for the laptop itself. So, hopefully that means that, my sound is clear to you. Somebody does say that they can hear me clearly. Good, that's good. That does make me feel a lot more relieved. All right, so let's dive right in then. The total duration of this session is intended to be 75 to 90 minutes. That's including any questions that you may have at the end. Like I said, we'll hopefully be done in an hour, right? In terms of the content itself. And we have some time at the end then hopefully to, address any questions. Before we dive right in, just want to let you know who I am, because, I've been talking for the last 5 to 10 minutes, and it'd be nice if you knew who I was. So my name is Matoo, right? I studied economics for most of my academic career. I did both my master's and my bachelor's in economics. Prior to moving to Bangalore, which is where I am now, I studied in Amsterdam for my master's, and I studied in Baroda in Gujarat for my bachelor's. When I was a little bit younger, when I was in my bachelor's, I really had not very much direction with my life and what I wanted to do. So, I guarantee you that all of you are in a better position. You're better thought out with, where you want to head in life than where I was at that stage. And I really didn't know better. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to do whatever the world seems to tell me that I'm good at doing. And that turned out to be standardized tests. So yeah, I'm that kind of nerd. I like standardized tests. I find them interesting. They're a fun challenge for me. It's like solving a puzzle. So I know that may not be, the most relatable experience, but I did find that it was the one thing that I was good at. And of course, if you're good at standardized tests, the world tells you, hey, okay, you should go to business school. You should, go do an exam that is particularly challenging on this front. And if you do well, you'll make it wherever you want to go. So, I did that, right? I did the CAT, which is for business schools in India. And I did the GRE, which is, for masters and some PhD programs all over the world. And I did fairly well on these tests. But at the last minute, I realized that, I like the tests. I didn't like what entailed from the test. I didn't actually want to go to business school. I didn't actually, want to, do a PhD or anything of the sort. What I really like doing is teaching. So, it's the sort of ideal marriage of my two passions, right? I like to teach. I like standardized tests. Teaching standardized tests makes a whole lot of sense for me. While I'm not teaching, I also, really enjoy cricket and football. Watching the World Cup, right, as it goes on now. And, I really like hip hop, video games, very into history, philosophy, politics, all of that kind of stuff. As you can see, these are not necessarily interests that coincide with, just trying to go to business school. Sometimes they are, but they're not common. And, ultimately I realized that, teaching is something that I'm much more psyched to do. I'm much more happy to do. So that's a little bit about myself. Let's talk a little bit about Crackverbal, right? So I work for Crackverbal, and what we do is test prep, but it's a little bit facile to say that, we do test prep because, everyone does test prep in some way. And ultimately, you're the one doing the test prep. We're helping you on that journey. So, the part of the most important part rather of, the whole test taking process and getting good at the test is something that you do yourself. So really, rather than just saying that we do test prep, I like to say that we help with your overall approach to making decisions for your career, right? So, for example, when I was like when I was like 20 or so, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna do the CAT, I'm gonna do well on the CAT and try to get into business school. There was nobody out there, sort of asking me, well, is this what you want to do? Is this a representation of your strengths? And even once that decision, even once that decision was made, there wasn't really anybody to suggest to me, well, okay, now that you know what it is that you want to do, how are you going to go ahead and do it, right? Like, what are the kinds of essays that you'll need to write? What do you want to say about yourself when you're writing an essay for universities? What is it that, universities are looking for? Where can you go, right? Like, everyone talks about the US, and if you're based in India, you probably are looking at Indian unis as well. But there's a whole lot of other options out there. And I think that, especially given the current political climate, it's probably worth it to at least think about all of the other options available. So, we really consider ourselves mentors and, helpers for every step of this process. We want to make sure that you have all of the steps locked down and, you're good to go. So here's some material that you can check out for free, right? It's not the entire course, but you can check out some of what we offer. You can see essentially, how we go about, the approach to breaking down a test, how we go about the approach to, understanding what the GMAT is so that you can beat it in the most effective way possible. In addition to this, we've, published a few ebooks that, they're really small snippets. It's, you hear ebook and you think, oh, it's going to be like a book and it's going to be very long. And, our attention spans have all dropped, right? It's hard to keep, our attention for a long period of time. It's much easier to look at a meme than read a book, isn't it? But, these are short books, right? They're easy plans that you can follow. And it's really, things that you can incorporate into your life despite being, busy with life itself, right? I mean, your job, unless you're very lucky, is probably not going to let you just take time off or totally phone it in while you prepare for the GMAT. So you have to have, a sort of composite plan in place for, how you're going to manage that, right? And as well as that, you have a limited amount of time, right? You have to use your time efficiently. In addition to this, I'm sure that some of you are already familiar with this, but we do have a YouTube channel, and of course, you can access various strategies about how to solve questions. Look out for the kinds of mistakes that we find that, at the end of the day, students make kind of the same mistakes. It's only human to be making some of those mistakes. And if you're aware of that and yourself, you can put yourself in a position to avoid that. You can put yourself in a position to sidestep that. And that's obviously massively advantageous for you. So yeah, we do have some strategy videos. All right, so let's get started, with the actual content for today. But before we do that, I'm just going to check the chat. I'm going to check the questions, see if there's anything worth answering. Some people have asked me if I'm from MSU, and yes, in fact, I am from MSU. I didn't grow up in Baroda, but it is where I went to do my bachelor's, not least because my entire degree cost me like 15,000 rupees. So, that's something that's, it's a life hack, right? Gave me time and resources to do other things with my life as well. So yeah, absolutely. Will you be showing us how to map the passage? All right, so sort of yes, sort of no, a little bit of both. The short answer is yes. We will be looking at, like what is it that you need to do in order to map a passage effectively, right? So absolutely. Let's take a look at the chat. Incidentally, yeah, somebody asked what, let's see what's happened. Okay. Cool. I think everyone's just saying that we want to get started, and I agree. Let's just dive in. All right, so a couple of housekeeping facts, right? The reading comprehension is just one of the three parts of the, verbal section as a whole. Within the reading comprehension, you will get 4 passages, sometimes 3, but almost always 4. And in each passage, you can expect 3 to 4 questions, right? So beyond that, we don't have any detailed understanding of, what you're going to be asked. The GMAT test, the reading so each passage is about 250 to 400 words. So you can have a fairly short passage that's, just a couple of short paragraphs. You can have a much longer passage that's like 4, paragraphs that are pretty substantial, pretty meaty. And you really have to be prepared for either one. The passage will always appear on the left-hand side of the screen. The questions will appear one at a time on the right-hand panel. So you'll see the passage on the left, questions on the right. This means that you will always have access to the passage. You don't have to like turn a page over. I mean, that obviously that's not true because you're not doing it on paper, but you don't have to like go back to the passage window or the passage tab. You'll always see the passage on the left-hand side of the screen. When you get the first question, you will not know how many questions there are for the passage. So, if you get question number 6 and it's a reading comprehension passage, well, you do know that 7 and 8 are going to be RC as well because it's 3 to 4 questions. But question number 9, you can't really say. So, you kind of have to plan in advance. Your passage could be 3 or 4. You can't fall behind regardless of whichever one it is. So this works out to about 12 to 16 questions. And it means that you'll be spending about 25 to 30 minutes out of the 65 on reading comprehension as a whole. That's quite a significant chunk. That's almost half the time that you'll be spending on the test. It's something that you'd have to keep in mind. It's the biggest section of the GMAT, even in terms of questions. It's 12 to 16 questions, right? And if 12 questions out of 36 is a third, you could say that's about 35 to 40% of your test. So certainly the biggest section, certainly the section that you have to be the most mentally settled for in order to do well on the GMAT. Excuse me. So there are really 5 major challenges to doing well, on GMAT reading comprehension. The first one of these is limited time. Ultimately, time is always going to be your biggest enemy, and it's one thing to solve a question right. It's another thing to solve a question right inside of a minute or inside of a minute and a half. And you obviously do have to work on being able to answer questions quickly. Ultimately, the goal that you want to target is 2 minutes per question. So if you have a passage that is 4 questions long, ideally it should take you about 8 minutes. If your passage is 3 questions long, it should take you about 6 minutes. Well, how do you do that if you don't know how long the passage is? Well, you're really looking at something like 6.5 to 7.5 minutes, right? Like, so you can compensate a little bit either way. Really what this means is that if you have a longish passage, you can take about 3.5 to 4 minutes to read it. If you have a shorter passage, you do want to be done with it in about 2 to 3 minutes, 3 minutes absolute tops, right? And about a minute to a minute and a half per question. All right, the next challenge is confusing content, right? And at this point, I'm going to open up a poll, right? So if we open up the polling tab, you may see that there are, 3 different polls available. And, I'm going to launch the first poll and give you about a minute to answer it. It says, what kind of passage do you find the hardest, right? And it's the heavy math and science related stuff, history, politics, economics related, art and philosophy, and ultimately, everything, because they're all hard. I'll keep the poll open for about a minute, right? Or until 85% of people answer, whichever comes first. All right, I do see that, a lot of you have voted, and, I think I'm just going to call it at this stage because no one else is really answering in. 103 responses. That's nice. That's a good sample size, right? Like in statistical analysis, we'd say that, well, that's actually something that we can work with. So about 8% of you, 8 of you, so a little bit less than 8% of you said that, the heavy math and science stuff is difficult. Okay, yes, that's understandable. About a quarter of you have said that it's the history, politics, and economics related stuff that's hard. And yeah, fair enough, right? If that's not really your wheelhouse, that's a difficult thing to get around. Almost half of you think that the art and philosophy related stuff is the hardest, right? And fair enough, right? I'm guessing that if a lot of you do not have a background in, the arts or philosophy, most school systems don't go out of their way to teach you, intellectual inquiry in these fields anyway. So, a lot of this stuff is just going to be absolutely new. It's stuff that you may not necessarily be familiar with. Don't worry, we're actually going to go over an an arts related passage over the course of this session. So fair enough, right? That's something that we will cover. And everything, they're all hard. So another 20% of you think that, well, all the passages are hard. And you know what? At the end of the day, the answer that I am actually most inclined to agree with is the final one, right? You could say that they're all hard or they're all easy. And really, at the end of the day, the content of the passage is something that we worry about a lot, and maybe we should worry about it a little bit less. And that's something that we'll be looking at, over the course of solving, a couple of passages. The next challenge is high mental stress. Yeah, it's a pretty stressful test. And of course, when you get a long passage, you get a passage on content that you're not familiar with, that naturally leads to more stress, right? And that's obviously something that you have to get around. Limited reading speed. Okay, so what if I don't read quickly enough, right? What if I'm simply not able to get through all of the content I need to? It certainly is a challenge, but it is something that we can work around, right? It's certainly a challenge, but it's something that you do not need to consider reading speed to be an impediment to you doing well, because the GMAT itself has already sort of baked reading speed into the equation. They understand if you're not particularly fast at reading, and they will sort of make sure that passages are within your scope to be read. If you find that you're still having trouble, that means that there were workarounds that you needed to think about, which we will be covering. Lastly, answering the questions correctly. At the end of the day, it is one thing to understand the passages. And I think that everyone's worry, and I saw some, messages on the chat that said, I understand the basic tips of how to look at an RC passage. My worry is, how do I read this passage? How do I understand what the passage itself is saying? And that because the passages often tend to be the most unfamiliar content, people tend to be worried about the passages, right? But at the end of the day, it is of no use to be able to understand the passage perfectly well if you can't answer the questions. In fact, if you don't understand the passage perfectly well, but you're able to answer the questions, I consider that job well done. You're not looking to become a philosopher. You're not looking to become a physicist, right? You're looking to answer these questions that have been asked about topics that just happen to be about philosophy or physics, and answer them correctly, right? So at the end of the day, remember that answering questions is always going to be your main focus. The passage and the content of the passage itself, not as significant, right? A couple of points on these challenges, right? We're going to look at like proper strategies to deal with these challenges, but a couple of points about dealing with these challenges outside of these strategies as well. High mental stress, right? The GMAT is a stressful exam. It's not just reading comprehension. The whole test is stressful. What do you do about that, right? The way that I see it is, things can't get worse, right? Things absolutely cannot get worse from where you are. And I don't mean that as in like, oh, where, things are already really bad. But my point is this: there's two possible outcomes. You get your target score, or you get the score that you need to get into university, get into business school, and you apply to business school and you make your life hopefully better than it was before, right? And that's nice. That's great. The other thing, right? Let's imagine now the Murphy's Law scenario, the worst case scenario. What happens if you do really poorly? What happens if you get, let's just not say poorly. Well, what happens if you get a 300, on the test? Nothing, right? Things continue as they are. It's not like the people at your work are gonna find out that you got less than 300, you got a 300 and be like, oh wow, this person is stupid, we're gonna demote them. That's not going to happen, right? Things cannot get worse. The only two outcomes are a neutral outcome and a positive outcome. And that should hopefully be freeing for you. That should hopefully free you up to realize that, well, this is an opportunity to make things better than they currently are, with no negative consequences, with no adverse consequences. So as long as you keep that in mind, you should largely be fine. When it comes to limited reading speed, right, you want to make sure that you focus on finishing the passage in a certain amount of time. If that means reading not all the words, so be it, right? So be it. You don't need to read all the words. You want to try to read all the words, but you don't need to read all the words. You need to get all the ideas. And that doesn't necessarily mean reading every single word carefully, right? And lastly, when it comes to answering questions correctly, right, always play the options, don't play the passage itself, right? Always play the options and the question, never play the passage. All right. So, I'm just going to take a few questions before we discuss the strategies themselves. All right, so how to comprehend long passages. Can we have a recording of the webinar? Yes, I believe that a recording is, I believe that it's recorded and then uploaded to YouTube in a while, I think like a few days after the webinar is done. So I think you can absolutely access it on YouTube once we're done with it. What should I do daily to improve reading comprehension? So, of course, practice helps. And I would recommend that, for all of you, right, on a day-to-day basis, if you're looking to practice RC on a regular basis to get better, it's a good idea to do like 3 RC passages a day. Even if you can find time for 2 RC passages a day, that's not bad at all. Not really necessary for you to go, completely, wild with the passages and do like 5 or 6. Then what happens is that the passages start to blend into each other and you forget about the clear, concrete lessons that each passage has to teach you. I do see that somebody's, are using the raise hand function. If you have a question, I recommend you ask it on the Q&A tab. All right, so let's see what's come up. Let's start with the concepts first. Okay. Yeah, let's start with the concepts first. Okay, this would induce confidence in the viewers. I agree, let's discuss the conceptual ideas, right? So what do you mean by skip words? What do you mean by play the options? So when I say skip words, what I mean is you don't have to read every single sentence, or rather you don't have to read every single sentence in second gear. When you're trying to understand something in detail, you tend to read slower so that you can process the information. But it's not essential for you to read every sentence like that. Some sentences are clearly not as important than others. Some sentences are clearly more important than others. What do you mean by play the options and the questions? So essentially what happens is that, the big mistake that students make is to worry about what the passage has said rather than deal with any traps or roadblocks that could be present in the options themselves. Ultimately, you want to focus solely on the options given rather than on, any other traps, right? So you want to focus solely on the options rather than on something the passage has said or something that you may have interpreted from what the passage has said. All right. Does reading newspapers help for reading comprehension? They're not great. They're not great. You're better off reading, if you want to read passages that are similar to reading comprehension passages, I would recommend reading research papers or the abstracts of research papers in general. Barring that, you just want to be able to read, I would say reading, articles in The Guardian or something like that would be helpful, right? If you go on The Guardian's website, you'll see that there are like 60 different articles on the front page. You'll probably be interested in like one of them, but that's still okay, right? So long as you're interested in one of them, right? It is important to try and read articles that are at least of a certain academic rigor, of a certain academic level. So, I would say that you do want to read academic papers as much as possible. The Economist is absolutely fine. I think that The Economist is okay. How to deal with RC from non-interesting topics or boring topics. Okay, cool. So I think that all of the questions that are being asked now are things that we're going to address moving forward. So let's, dive back into that. Okay, so 5 strategies, right? And what are these strategies? Let's, find out, right? So the first one says, look at the passage as if you were the author. Okay, now what does that mean? So think about why this passage has been written in the first place. It's not that this person has written the passage solely for it to end up on the GMAT or the GRE or the LSAT. I mean, if I gained all of the, diverse esoteric knowledge that these passages have to offer, and if I had all of that knowledge and my job was writing passages for them to end up in a standardized test to be, kind of half read by students, I think I would kill myself, to be honest, right? Like that's a very sad life, to have all that knowledge and that knowledge just gets used up in, writing passages for the GMAT. So really, safe to say that that's not what happens in real life. The passages aren't written solely for, ending up on the GMAT or the GRE or the LSAT. These passages are written, like I said, in academic papers or scientific journals or, just magazines that consider themselves a little bit more intellectual, like National Geographic or Reader's Digest or, something like that. It's stuff that is already academic or bordering on academic material, right? And this is very important to understand, because what it means is that the author who has written this passage has written it with a certain intent for you, the reader, right? If it's appeared in some kind of academic paper, the author is trying to communicate some information to you. She wants you to understand something on the basis of what has been written. She wants you to understand, whatever concept it is, right? Whatever it is that she's talking about. She ultimately has one main idea that she wants you to get at, right? And in doing so, she's going to choose her sentences very carefully so that they lead up to communicating that idea. In many ways, this is very similar to what you would do on, the AWA itself, right? So when you write the AWA, you pick apart an argument, right? Somebody gives you an argument and you point out that the argument is a bad one because of whatever reasons, right? The same thing is essentially being done by the author in a reading comprehension passage. When you point out that the argument is flawed, you first say what you think the flaw is. You then provide some evidence to, that shows that really that is a flaw. And then you analyze how that fits into your overall argument or something to that effect. Now, what that means is that, you have a certain mechanical approach to writing your sentences because you have a very specific idea that you're trying to communicate. Remember that the author of the RC passage is in exactly the same boat and therefore is going to do exactly the same thing, right? So when you read sentences, right, never read them for the focus with the purpose of saying, well, oh, what is this sentence talking about? Instead, ask yourself, why has the author written this sentence? What is the author trying to make me understand by writing this sentence, right? So when you approach reading any passage, you want to focus on, well, why is the author writing the sentence the way that she has? What is it that she's trying to communicate to me by writing this sentence? An interesting example of this would be, let's say that, you read the sentence. It is only since the 1970s that all schools in the US have become desegregated. Okay, so that is, it's something related to history, so that's already not that appealing unless you like history, right? And I'm guessing most of you don't, right? From the answers that you've given me on the poll. So, yeah, that's not ideal, right? It's about history. It used the word desegregation, right? Or being desegregated. That's a complicated idea. I don't know what that means, right? I'm not, I know that it has something to do with separation, but I don't understand the historical context. I don't know the history of the US, so I can't even, necessarily understand what the context is of what's being said. But really, instead of trying to focus on what does this sentence say, try and think about what the author is really trying to say. So if she says, it is only since the 70s that schools have been desegregated. She's telling you this one piece of information, but within it, there's two hidden pieces of information as well. By using the word only, she's saying that this is kind of shocking in some way, or that this is actually quite recent, or it's more recent than expected, or, you know, she herself believes that, you know, that this is maybe not the best thing, you know, that it's only since the 70s, maybe this should have happened earlier, right? So without explicitly telling you this, she is telling this to you, right? Without explicitly saying it, that this is a very recent development or whatever, she is indicating to you what her position on this issue is. She's indicating to you what she thinks about this, right? So that's one point. The next point is that if she says that since the 70s, schools in the US have become desegregated, she's also saying that before the 70s, some schools were still segregated. And that's important, you know, because the way that reading comprehension in school has trained us to think is that, you know, it gives us a question, we replace the question word with the answer, and then we copy the rest of the sentence verbatim. So really what that does is it teaches us to recognize where important parts of a passage are. It teaches us to recognize where the answer might be and replace the question with the answer. It's just recognition. That has its own value. I'm not going to, you know, try to shit all over the way of how we do reading comprehension. That has its own value. But the GMAT doesn't work that way. It's a different test. It's a different kettle of fish. So essentially, it requires you to comprehend or take away the hidden meaning of what has been said. So, you know, and that's why the passages may seem difficult to comprehend, because the questions that you get after don't even sometimes, you know, you're like, oh, did I even see this or not? And that can lead to further confusion. You know, can I even find this somewhere in the passage or not? But the reality is that, no, you probably can't find it in the passage, you know, or you can, but it's information that comes from knowing some other information, right? So if you find out it's only since the 70s that schools have become desegregated, that means that before the 70s, this desegregation had not happened yet, right? And you will actually be much more likely to get a question that is phrased on those terms rather than on the terms of what the actual sentence has said. So remember to look at the passage as if you are the author writing it and you have a purpose. Or if not, ask yourself, why has the author written this? Or if I were the author and I wrote this sentence, what am I trying to tell the audience by writing this sentence? What is it that my intention is behind writing this sentence? Not what is it that I wrote in the sentence itself, right? So that's something that you want to focus on. The next tip to look at is to pick up on the gist of the passage. And, you know, somebody asked a question earlier about mapping a passage, and this is exactly it. All right. So when we say the gist, right, the gist of something is a very basic, watered down idea of what something is. And, you know, that's a real word, right? That's an actual word. We've made it into an acronym. So, you know, don't go around telling people that gist is actually an acronym. It's not an acronym. We have just made it into one because it's easy to remember. The general idea, the structure, and the tone. When you read a passage, read it with intent. Don't read it to think, okay, you know, I'm going to read this thing that's like 3 paragraphs long about why, you know, Kierkegaard's philosophy says that we should realize that we are miserable. No, I don't need to do that, right? Just reading the passage alone makes me miserable. So rather than doing that, rather than trying to think, hey, I'm going to read a specific passage just to, you know, understand the passage itself, realize that you are reading a passage like it's a treasure hunt. You're reading a passage with a specific intent. So when you dive in, there are going to be 3 types of things to look out for. You want to look out for the general idea of the passage, right? What are the main ideas that the passage is trying to communicate? What is the main intention of the author? What is it that he or she wants you to understand? You want to understand what the structure of the passage is, right? So when you map out your passage, when you take down any notes, or when you write anything down, or when you conceptualize of what the passage is, you want to have a sense of the structure, right? You want to know what happened in the first para, what happened in the second para, what happened in the third para. The reason for this is that it will allow you to look for answers to questions much more easily. The last thing that you want to look out for is tone. Right? And this is not really, you know, so much about what is said in the passage. It's much more about how the author perceives what's being said. So what is the author's point of view? Are there other people's points of view? Is the author describing something in a very positive way? Is the author describing something in a very negative way? Right? Ultimately, this reveals to you how the author might feel about something. And if you have done RC passages in the past, you know that you will get questions that go like, the author will be most likely to agree with which of the following. So therefore, you need to know what the author is thinking about, right? You need to know what the author's tone is, what the author's point of view is, and what is it that she agrees with or maybe doesn't agree with, right? So that's something that you have to look out for. And essentially, you want to take these down as notes. This process is called mapping the passage, right? So taking down the general idea, the structure, and the tone. You read the passage with the intent of finding the gist, and you take down the general idea, structure, and tone, right? So maybe, you write a few words for para 1, a few words for para 2, a few words for para 3, but you want to take down only the main ideas, only what the author is trying to communicate to you. You don't want to try to take down everything, right? You don't want to try and put down, oh, this is important, that is important. It's not the details themselves. And an easy way to think about this is that, well, it's called mapping the passage. If it's called mapping the passage, right? What does your map do? It does what a map does in real life. It helps you find things. So remember this, right? Like don't write your map, don't make your map with the intention of writing down things that could be the answers to questions down the line. This is the most common mistake students make when taking down notes. They think, hey, okay, like this could be important. This could be the answer to a question. Maybe I should note this down. This could be important. There could be a question here. I should note this down. That's not what you're trying to do with a map. A map is simply going to tell you where to go looking for the answers. So when you see the question, you will still not necessarily know where the answer is, but you can look at your map to tell you, this is how I get there. So ultimately, your map is just like a map in real life, except, it's a little bit less Google Maps and it's a little bit more pirate map. It's something that you've made in a hurry. It's something that is, very sort of haphazard and vague. It doesn't have to, have all of the details furnished in. And like many other pirate maps, it only makes sense to you. It is your approach. It's your shorthand and it's your conception of what you think would be important to note down. No two maps are going to look the same, and your map is to be designed as something that works for you. The shorthand that you use has to be something that works for you, right? We're going to try out a couple of passages and sort of map them out. You'll have a look at how I would map out such a passage, and based on that, we can answer questions a lot more easily. So that is something that we will do with actual passages moving forward. But remember that this is the base approach that you want to follow. Don't try to read the passage aimlessly. Read the passage with intent. It's a treasure hunt, and you're trying to find out these 3 items. If you can find these 3 things properly, then you're good to go. Understanding and answering the questions of the passage will be far easier, regardless of how good your understanding of the passage itself is. Let's take a look at the third point. Ignore the topic and don't let it psych you out. Okay, so I asked you all what you think is the hardest topic, right? What are the hardest kinds of passages? And obviously this is the answer that I always get, right? I don't like doing X type of passage. I don't like doing Y type of passage. Whenever I get a passage like this, my mind goes blank and I don't know what to do. Don't let this psych you out, right? Because like we said before, you're not trying to become an expert in philosophy. There's no way that reading this article will make you an expert on philosophy, right? You're not trying to become an expert on American history or, the second wave feminist movement and what their demands were. You're not trying to become an expert on any of these things, right? What you are trying to do is answer questions. And, what's even more so true is that the GMAT knows this and they operate with that knowledge. There's a reason that the passages are so diverse. There's a reason that there's passages in business, there's passages in business, in physical sciences, in life sciences, in social sciences, and in the arts and philosophy. The reason is that they know that there is no one person who will be familiar with all of these kinds of topics, right? Or such a person is very, very rare, right? That there's no one who likes all the things, right? There's got to be something that bores you or something that, just confuses you or that you're not good with. I know that, okay, I like the history stuff. I like the philosophy stuff. I like the stuff about arts, but I really don't like the stuff about biology or about the sciences, right? It's because that's not my strength. That's not what I was good at, in university, and it continues to be what I'm not great at. I don't mind physics and chemistry, but yeah, biology is certainly not my thing, right? Or anatomy, or like just anything related to health. But the thing is that I'm not trying to be an expert in any of these things, right? And the GMAT knows that. The GMAT has set questions that do not require your knowledge of the topic at hand. In fact, the GMAT expects you to be able to answer the questions without any knowledge at all of any of the topics that they give you. They want you to be able to answer a question no matter what. They hope, in fact, that you don't have background knowledge going in, because in many cases, background knowledge can actually be bad for you. Sometimes you'll get a passage about India or something like that, and maybe you're familiar, maybe you know a little bit about the topic they're talking about. What happens then is that you can fall into the trap of using your external knowledge to help you answer questions. And that's a big no-no, that you cannot use your external knowledge to answer questions, because, well, the GMAT expects you to answer the questions without any knowledge whatsoever, right? So they will give you questions where, having external knowledge could even be a trap, right? So ultimately, do not let the passage itself strike you out. Everything about a difficulty of the passage comes from the questions and the questions alone, right? So it's always going to be like, what makes a passage hard is not the content itself. Sometimes you'll get passages that are nightmarishly hard to read, but if you just persevere enough with them to get the gist, you'll realize that, oh, with like a 5 out of 10 understanding of what the passage was about, I could still answer most of the questions. I could still answer all of the questions right. Sometimes you'll find that a passage makes total sense, but the questions have been picked so carefully and with such thought that they're very difficult to answer and that you'll mess them up. So remember that the difficulty of the passage is not relevant when it comes to the difficulty of the question. It is always, how are the options set up? It is never, what is the content of the passage. If you remember that, what will happen is that at the very least, when you get a passage in something that you don't like, you don't worry that this is going to be your downfall. All you need to think is, well, okay, new passage, let's find out what the gist is. I don't need to know anything else. I'll just find out what the gist is, and let me use that to help answer whatever questions come up for it, right? And this means that you always want to focus on the answer options, right? The difficulty is provided by the answer options, and that is something that you have to really learn to overcome by looking out for traps within them, by looking out for what kinds of answers could be easily eliminated, what kinds of answers do you really have to look to eliminate, right? I'm going to try out one very simple question beforehand. All right, so let's see if I can put this in. Okay, so my question here is, what is the second largest city in Slovenia? Right, and that seems like it's a very difficult question. Right? I'm guessing that you probably don't know very much about Slovenia. So let's put in some options then. Let's try Zagreb, Bratislava, Maribor, Ljubljana, and Sarajevo. Okay, now this is a difficult question, right? If you know the answer to this question, you can put it in on the chat if you know it for sure. But that's a difficult question. How are you going to know the answer to this, right? Maybe if you're familiar with some of the Eastern European football teams, you might have a sense of what the answer is here. But really, it's a difficult question, right? Now I'm going to ask you the exact same question, but I'm going to change up the answer options, and I guarantee you that all of you will know the answer to the question that I just asked. All right, New York, London, Bengaluru, Maribor, and Los Angeles. All of a sudden, this is the easiest question now, right? All of a sudden, this question is super, super straightforward. there's no way that you wouldn't know that the answer is Maribor, right? And this is a good example of a microcosm of what the RC itself gives you. They could give you a passage, and the passage could be very complicated or something you know nothing about. Maybe you don't know very much about Eastern European geography, but through eliminating the answers and focusing on the options, you will be able to get to the answer more carefully. And that is what you want to focus on rather than on the passage itself. Now, the really big challenge is that you will probably get a question that is something like this. So New York, Bengaluru, Los Angeles, go ahead, get rid of them. Yeah, they're certainly not the capital of Slovenia. But then you have Ljubljana and Maribor. And this is difficult because, if you know a bit about your geography as well, you may know that Ljubljana is the capital of Slovenia and the largest city in Slovenia. So now you have two options that are genuinely plausible, and that's what makes the question hard. And that's what the GMAT tries to do. You'll notice that no matter what the question is, even if it's the hardest looking question, there's always going to be two options that are totally ridiculous. And you just need to focus on getting those options out of the way, getting those options, realizing that these are not correct and eliminating them. Then you can really consider and play around with the remaining two or the remaining three, and then try to zero in on the right answer. Your task is made a whole lot easier if you do the easy bits first and then take on the actual challenge, right? It's also better to do this because at the end of the day, there's no guessing penalty on the GMAT. This means that if you can come down to two answer options and you really have no idea what to do at the end, you should guess. In fact, the GMAT expects you to guess. The kind of person who gets like a 42 or a 43 on the verbal section probably made about 5 mistakes, right? I know this because that's kind of what my most recent result was. I made 5 mistakes. Now, that didn't mean that I didn't know the answer to 5 questions. That actually meant that I didn't know the answer to like 8 or 9 questions. The difference was that for all of those 8 or 9 questions, I came down to 2 options or 3 options and then just went ahead and guessed something. Some of the times I was right. More often I was wrong, but some of the times I was right. And that helped me get those necessary points to move all of the way up. That's the difference between getting a 38 and a 43. That's the difference between getting a 30 and a 35, right? And that's a significant difference, and you should make sure that you do the easy bits first, you eliminate the easy answer options, then focus on the difficult ones to get to your answer. Lastly, you want to focus on the points of view. This may not be there in every single passage, but there will certainly be a lot of passages that have multiple points of view. And what you want to do is you want to focus on what these points of view are. You want to make sure that you have a clear understanding of who is on which team, right? The details about the points of view do not matter, right? Guy has said, but you don't need to know everything about what the one guy has said. You need to know what team this guy is on. You need to know what the other team is, and maybe one basic difference between the two, just so that you can differentiate yourself. When you get a question about one or both of the teams or one or both of the points of view, you can then refer to that part of the passage and get a sense of what they're trying to tell you there, right? To use an analogy here, all you need to know is that there is a team Edward and a team Jacob. And maybe that Edward is a werewolf, is a vampire, and Jacob is a werewolf. You don't need to know what are the weaknesses of vampires and werewolves and which side is better or which side actually wins in the end, or how they impacted the Twilight books or anything like that. All you need to know is that there is a team Edward and a team Jacob. The rest you can figure out when you're actually asked the question. But knowing that there are those teams is very important and is very essential, because you're very likely to get a question about points of view. And if there are different points of view, they generally form the central focus of the passage. It will be different theories about topic X. And that gives you a sense then of what the passage is overall trying to convince you of. It gives you a sense of what the general idea of the passage is. And if you realize that there are points of view, it'll probably give you a sense of the structure as well. One paragraph for one point of view, one paragraph for another point of view, maybe, right? So keep that in mind when you approach answering questions. Now I'm going to take a slight pause here to answer questions that have come up on the chat, but we will then now get into actually solving some RC passages. All right. So I do see that, yeah, are you recommending the Guardian International? Yes, that is correct, right? So somebody said only has a commanding tone to it. Is it not a possibility or a requesting tone? It depends on where it's used in the sentence, right? Or it depends on what context it has been used in. However, right, you don't want to see it as I saw the word only, therefore it means this. You want to see in the context of the passage, what is the idea that the author is trying to say to me, right? In a paragraph, if you had to write the paragraph as just the one sentence, what you'd want to think then is, well, what would that one sentence be? If the author only had one sentence to express her entire idea, what is the main idea? What is the one thing that she really wants me to understand, right? So that's what you want to look out for. If you see words like however, okay, so that's another question. That's a good question, actually. If you see a word like however, you know that whatever ideas come before, the idea that's about to come next is going to be in contrast to that first idea, right? And that helps you know that, well, if the previous tone was positive, this is going to be negative, or vice versa, right? Should we go ahead and infer what the author is trying to say? Absolutely. You should try to always infer what the author is trying to say. You should try to think about what does the author mean by her words, right? What is the overall idea that she's trying to communicate by her words? I'm going to see what the questions that have come in are. Okay. Source for practicing RCs apart from the official questions. I do want to address this because ideally you should only be focusing on the official questions. If you've absolutely run out of all of the official questions, one thing that you can do is, go on, check out the RC Butler, right, on gmatclub.com. They give you access to 2 RC passages every day, and that's a good source. They sometimes use questions that are from the LSAT, but they're generally at least somewhat well curated. So that's probably the best way to go about it. Where can we practice reading? If you read books, you read newspaper articles sometimes, right? If it's the Guardian or if it's the Hindu, they're somewhat okay. And if you read academic papers and journals, right? If you just look up academic paper abstracts or free academic paper abstracts, you will be able to find some information. However, it's better to see reading comprehension for the RC as a specific skill in itself, right? So yes, it's good to read books. I won't say don't read books. I won't say don't read articles, don't read papers. I won't say any of those things, but the main focus should be practicing RC questions themselves, right? Really, you should be practicing RC questions yourselves. So what is the tone and gist? The tone and gist is simply the T, right? It's the acronym, right? So it's the T. A lot of questions about, about the understand, whether newspapers are helpful or not. They are somewhat helpful, right? They're not totally useless, but practicing questions is more helpful than anything else, right? So let us now get into actually trying to solve a passage, right? In fact, let us move to a pretty complicated passage. So I had 2 passages up, and I thought I'll based on what you guys tell me is the more difficult or more complex idea, I think that's something that that would be the thing that we should look at doing. And let's take a look at this one passage over here. All right, so it's not the longest passage, and I'm going to give you 3 minutes, right? So it's 2034 when it becomes 2038, so 3.5 minutes. We'll discuss how to do it. In the meantime, I will physically make a map for it myself right now as well. So have a read and we'll discuss. All right. So it's been 3.5 minutes. Now, hopefully this was enough time for you to read the passage itself, right? At least just read the passage and maybe, take down a few of your own notes, or, be able to have a grip on what the passage has said as a whole. Now, in this time, I have made a map, and I am currently going to put that map up on the screen. So let me send this to myself. I believe that it is not as clear as it should be. So let me see if another picture here might help. Yeah, I think the second picture is certainly a lot more clear. Okay, so there we go. So let's try and switch from what the passage says. Yeah, okay. So we have that jazz is, that it says that, wait a second. Okay, many musicologists consider jazz the only purely American form of music. Now, you know what? One common mistake I've seen is that you see the first word, oh, it's musicologist, and the musicologist consider something. So I'm going to write down the word musicologist because maybe that matters. But the reality is that, well, we can see that the first paragraph is pretty short. So let's read ahead and try to think about, well, what is the author trying to introduce to me anyway? So many musicologists consider jazz the only purely American form of music. Others, however, great. So we know immediately that there is a conflict and there is a divergence in opinions. Others, however, argue that jazz is rooted in a history similar to that of America itself, a history of confluence. Great. So there's two sides of the argument, right? There's jazz is purely American and jazz is history's confluence, possibly not purely American, right? Like possibly, it's saying pure American versus not pure American. There is a little bit of confusion over there. It really could be either. So that's a bit confusing. That's something that we definitely have to try to get around. But okay, at least we do know that the central idea of the first paragraph is this. What was the general idea of it? It's that it tells us that we're going to be talking about jazz. It tells us that this whole passage is going to be about jazz in some way, and that there are different opinions about jazz. So great. So I've split this into two sides, and I've said pure American versus, confluence or being not American. Okay, so let's see what the next paragraph has to say. The immigration of Europe and the slave trade of West Africans to America resulted in a convergence of cultures, traditions, and art forms, including music. Okay, so they're telling us something about how Europe and West Africa, sort of came together, right? Or they came together in the US. Okay, I'm not going to take anything down just yet. Jazz, first played in the New Orleans from the early 1900s, borrowed heavily from the European musical scale and harmonic system. Okay, so they're telling us that jazz was first played in New Orleans and that it has a European influence. Jazz instruments were built predominantly on European ensembles, such as the trumpet, trombone, saxophone, and piano. Okay, so there's a lot of European influence in jazz. The West African influence on jazz was manifested. Now, at this point, I would even stop and say that, well, okay, the first sentence is telling us about Europe and West Africa. So that they're really trying to tell us that Europe and West African influences came together to create whatever, right? That there was a convergence, including in music. So presumably, they didn't say jazz here, but obviously they're talking about how this is relevant to jazz because, well, why would they be talking about anything else? That's what this passage is about. So Europe and West Africa have come together to talk about, European and West African influences come together to make jazz what it is, right? So Europe plus West Africa makes jazz. Wait a second, that's not right. Okay. And then we have the European influences, and then we have the West African influences. I didn't even read what it said for the West African. The West African influence on jazz was manifested primarily in its performance. Now, I didn't put down that the European influence was instruments or that the West African influence was performance. That would be a good example of something that is good high-level knowledge about the passage. And if you have a deep understanding of the passage, you will get at that. You will get to a sense of what that has to say. However, it is not something that you need to know straight off the bat, right? It is not something that you definitively need to know. What is this passage itself trying to tell you? Or rather, what is this paragraph itself trying to tell you? It's trying to tell you that European and West African influences came together, and it's trying to show you, right? The authors, so if you think from the author's point of view, she's trying to show you that, well, hey, okay, here is the European influence on jazz. Good, I made my point. Here's the West African influence on jazz. Good, I've made my point now that jazz has its influence from both Europe and West Africa, right? The whole point that she was trying to make here is that jazz has influences from both places. And that's why she's giving evidence to show what is the influence from Europe, evidence to show what is the influence from West Africa, right? So ultimately, you know, what you want to focus on is the thrust of the passage itself, not what are the details of the passage. The details of the passage you can always look up. I know where it is in the passage. I know it's in paragraph 2. If I get asked a question about the details, I will be able to answer it regardless. Proponents of the argument that jazz is purely American, so people who believe that jazz is purely American, often point to its genesis in New Orleans as evidence for this perspective. Great. So there, we know that there were two groups of people, right? Pure American and then, you know, confluence or not American. So they point to its genesis in New Orleans. The ones who say pure American, they're like, hey, it's pure American because it started in New Orleans, so it's pure American. The irony, however, immediately now I've learned something else. What I've learned is that the author does not agree with the pure American theory, right? Because immediately it's saying, oh, the people who believe there's pure American say this. The irony, however, so, you know, I already know it, right? It's still worth reading the sentence, but it's now telling me that, oh, the irony, however, is that the essence of America lies in the plurality of its roots. So the irony is that, you know, the thing that makes something American is that plurality. The thing that is American is the plurality. To deny the rich and complex history of jazz and the true origins of the art form is in effect denying the very aspects of the art form that make it undeniably American. Now that's a little bit confusing because the author is saying here something about, okay, the author's not, she's not on the team of, you know, jazz is purely American. She's trying to say that, you know, she's on the team of confluence. She's on the team of plurality, all of these things coming together. But at the same time, she is saying that jazz is undeniably American. So really what we have to realize, you know, from this is that you can have points of view, but in a passage like this, and I've deliberately selected this passage because it is an example of a fairly difficult one. The points of view might be different, but they are not necessarily opposing. So it's not that jazz is pure American versus jazz is not American. Both sides think that jazz is very American, right? Both sides are very clear on that. Jazz is an American art form. One side is saying jazz is purely American because it started in America. Another side is saying that jazz is American because it didn't start, because it started, or not started, but because it has influences from all over the world. So really the author is on the side of plurality and confluence, and she is not on the side of pure American, right? So as we can see, the author is really focusing on the author is focusing on, you know, the fact that there is plurality and confluence, right? And that she's on this other team, and she's not, she's not on the team of it being pure American. So that's all we need to know. We need to know that there was a team Edward and a team Jacob. Wow, I don't know why it's doing this. This is a bit awkward. Yeah, okay. We need to know that there were the two teams, pure American and confluence. And it turns out that confluence was not American. So now I've crossed that out, right? So I just know that it's pure American versus confluence. And they didn't really mention anyone else. It's just the author herself. So we know that the author is team confluence, right? And that's all it is that I'm going to take away. Now, if we really had to break this passage down just from what is said on the map, what is the passage saying? It's saying that jazz, there's a conflict about what jazz is, right? Whether it's pure American or not, right? We can see that there are influences from Europe and West Africa. The pure American people believe that jazz is pure American because it started in the US, but the author does not believe this. The author is on the side of confluence. That's it. That's really all there is to the passage. There is a debate about jazz, whether it's one side or the other. We see the influences of jazz, and the author picks what her side is. That's all you have to understand. You don't need to understand the details about the origins. All you need to pick up on is that, hey, there are these two sides and the author has picked one of these two sides. And that's really all there is to it, right? That's really all there is that you'd want to get out of this as a whole. Now, if you'd like, you can screenshot this, right? So I'm just going to give you the opportunity over the next 10 seconds to screenshot this, but I am going to move the slide back to the, to the picture, to the questions themselves, and we can have an opportunity to answer the questions as well. All right, so let's go back to the questions. Okay, at the same time, right, there's another polling window that I'm going to open up. It is passage 2, right? And I'm launching the poll. So as you figure out the answers to questions, you can answer questions 1, 2, 3, and 4, but we will discuss the questions themselves anyway, right? So the first one says, it can be inferred from the passage that the author would be less inclined to label jazz an American art form if which of the following were true. Now, already, in the question, right, it's an inference-based question. This means that the answer to the question is not going to be contained in the question itself, right? Ultimately, right, what is this telling us? It's telling us, first of all, that the author thinks jazz is very American. So it's telling us that for sure. It's also saying that the author would be less inclined to label jazz an American art form if one of these factors is true. So we are looking at something that will make the author less likely to say that this is an American art. Why does the author say that this is an American art? Because of confluence, right? The author was on team confluence. So now we know that, oh, the author thinks that confluence is what makes this American. So what would be the thing that we're looking for that would make it less American? It would be the absence of confluence itself. If there's no confluence, then it would suggest that this thing is not actually American. So that's really what we want to look out for, right? Is this thing American, or is this thing have confluence, or does this thing not have confluence, right? Now I'm going to give you about half a minute to go through the options and try to answer, the question yourself, and then we will discuss the question. We'll discuss how it would be answered. If you have an answer, please put it in on the polling window. If not, I see that maybe some people have put the answer in C. Okay, so a bunch of you have answered C and are not using the polling window itself. Okay, so that's cool, right? A bunch of you have said that it's that it's C. Cool. I think that's a good. That's correct, right? That's absolutely right. And for those of you who didn't get there, let's just take a look at what's going on here. New Orleans was not the place where jazz music was first played. Now, why I like this option is that it tells you something about what kinds of wrong options the GMAT will put in place as well, right? And it's worth thinking about that. It's worth realizing that, it's the options where the GMAT will try to trap you. Now, this is the view of the other group. This is the view of the pure American team. We know that the author is not on that team, so we can very easily eliminate it. But it's interesting that that is an option that they've put, people who believe that it was on that team. They don't just put a random option with random words. They try to think about how it is that you might mess up in your understanding and give an option then that is plausible given that mess up. So, okay, New Orleans was not the place. That is not what the author would think. That is what the others would think. Jazz music was first created in New Orleans when 4 avant-garde musicians from different musical backgrounds came together to experiment with unprecedented musical concepts. This has so much confluence going on, right? It's 4 musicians from different backgrounds. They're making something new out of the coming together of everything. That's coming together. That's confluence. That cannot be right. D says, jazz music actually draws more of its character from South American and Native American traditions than from those of Europe or West Africa. This is a kind of tempting option, especially if you know a thing or two about jazz. You know that it has nothing to do with South American or Native American musical traditions, right? So you'd be like, yeah, okay, that seems fair enough, right? That would make the author, that would make everyone less inclined to call jazz American. But if we look at only the information given to us in the passage and only what we can infer from the passage, the author thinks jazz is American and the author is on team confluence. even though this is a different type of confluence, it's still a confluence. It's North American and it's Native American and South American traditions coming together that have led to the author seeing things this way, right? So that would still be confluence. That's out. West African musical styles are influenced by the musical traditions of a variety of musical Middle Eastern cultures. Fair enough. So if that's the case, there's even more confluence. The West African influence is there. That itself comes from the Middle East. So that means there's even more confluence going on. Certainly not what we're looking for. And yes, that's why the right answer here would be C. Now, this is an example of a very difficult question, right? In fact, when I try this question out with students who come for personal tutoring, or, students who are just in general, trying out harder RC passages, this is the one that they almost universally get wrong. But once we understood what the passage was talking about, it became a whole lot easier. Now, remember this, you just want to read the passage once, right? And in the process of reading this passage once, you want to make sure that you just pick up on those very basic details. What are the basic details you can pick up on? The passage is talking about jazz. There's some conflict, right, about how they're talking about jazz. If I had to, represent the words in the conflict, I would say pure American and confluence. These are the two sides, right? I don't need to know what those sides are in detail. Here, they're telling me about the origins of jazz. Okay, cool, right? And they're saying there's some European origins, some West African origins. Cool, that is nice to know, right? So first paragraph, it's talking about jazz and there's a conflict about it. Second paragraph, they're telling us about how jazz came to be and they're telling us about European and West African. The third thing is that we're finding out what the author's opinion is. We're finding out what she believes about jazz, right? And that she is not on one team and she supports the other team, right? Among those two teams that she introduced in the beginning. That's all you need to pick up on in order to eliminate all of the 4 wrong answers. Remember that you always want to eliminate 4 wrong answers. You don't want to just pick answers based on what seems like it could be correct. You want to get rid of answers because they look like they would not be correct. That's always a better strategy than trying to pick answers. We touched upon elimination in the past, but as you can see, it works well in practice here. All right, any questions at this point? Is it advisable to take notes? Absolutely, and we saw this happen in practice, right? So, that we obviously have to work on process of elimination. Yes, this is something that you already know, but it is very, very important, right? It is something that you cannot disregard. And too many people do disregard it regardless, right? So that's something that you have to, sort of focus on. So I see that the answers have come in. What would be the difficulty level in terms of 600 and 650 plus? I would say that this is the kind of passage that if you get all 4 questions correct, you're looking at getting a 700. If you get about 3 out of 4 questions correct, you're looking at something in that 660 to 680, 690 kind of range, right? And so it's certainly on the hard side, right? I would say it's a 650 plus passage. That would probably be a good example of it. All right, so let's take a look now at question 2. By the way, I saw that some of you were not able to answer. You said they're only able to answer 1 question. So I think that, let's say question 1, these are the answers, question 2, these are the answers, question 3, answers, question 4. But it does seem like, the polling thing is not really working out so well for you guys. So, I think that you can just put the answers on the chat. That's also cool. So once again, right, I'm going to give you a minute. Take a look at the question, put your answer in, and we will discuss it. All right, I see some answers have come in. A lot of you think it is answer option D. I did see an E as well, right? So cool, right? I think that's a tempting option as well. D is correct, right? And wisdom of the crowds, right? You can see that in action here, that ultimately if a lot of you think that the answer is something that, generally the wisdom of the crowds does tend to be correct, right? So let's take a look at the answer options and see, why it really is D. So the author would most likely agree with which of the following. Now, the thing is, that's a vague question. right? Agree with which of the following about what? We don't necessarily know yet. So what do we know about the author's point of view? When we try to find out the gist of the passage, when we try to find out the general idea, the structure and the tone, what did we identify about the tone? We understood that the author is on team confluence. Let's take a look at that and see how that can help us answer the question. Although American football was derived from the English sports of soccer and rugby, it should be called purely American because it was first played in America. Once again, that's not team confluence, so we can go ahead and get rid of that. Because American football was derived from the English sports of soccer and rugby, it should not be called an American sport. Okay, now this is very, very interesting because the thing that it's asking us about, first of all, has nothing to do with jazz itself. It's about soccer and rugby, right? But we are trying to follow the same analogy. We're trying to follow the same kind of reasoning. And essentially, the author doesn't think that jazz is not American. The author very much thinks that jazz is American. The author thinks that jazz is American because of the fact that it came from soccer and rugby. So that's, or rather because it came from Europe and West Africa. So that's not exactly right either. Most sports scholars deny the English origins of American football. That's a fact statement, and we can't know anything about that because we don't know anything about English or American football and its origins. What makes American football essentially American is that it's derived from the convergence of soccer and rugby. Absolutely, right? Because what the author is trying to say is that this thing is American, but it's American because of confluence. And those two things come together to say that, yes, indeed, this is what the author would agree with. Lastly, some of you did pick E. Because the essence of America lies in the plurality of its roots, American football should not be called an American sport, right? Now, this is very, very close because they've used the same words, because the essence of America lies in the plurality of its roots, right? The essence of America lies in the plurality of its roots. Now, this is the trap of, we call it cute phrasing. It's a trap that is essentially, you have picked the answer based on recognition rather than on comprehension of the author's idea. Remember that you don't want to focus on the words used in the passage. You want to focus on the conceptual ideas themselves, right? So really, even though you can say because it derives from the plurality, but really what the author is trying to say is that American football would be called an American sport, or rather the author is saying that jazz is American. So, the plurality makes it American. And that's why answer option E is not correct, even though it is kind of tempting. Any questions here? Should E be avoided because the most is used? E should be avoided for all other reasons as well, because see, what has been followed up here is all in A, B, D, and E is all conditional statements that work along the same analogy of the jazz is American, argument that has been put forward. With C, we'd have to actually know whether scholars think this or not. We don't know whether the author thinks scholars think this or not. So that is why C is a totally different fact. It's something totally different. So really, yes, C is asking us about something very different. Should we avoid extreme words? Okay, firstly, how do you know it's an analogy question? I know it's an analogy question because it's not talking about jazz, right? It's asking us about something else. That means, so an analogy would be following the same reasoning when applied to different circumstances. What would we know about American football from this passage? Nothing, so it has to be an analogy. Should we avoid extreme words? Should we avoid superlatives? Okay, interesting, yes. Now, it's not the case that they're always going to be wrong, but if you see a superlative or an extreme word, your spidey senses should be tingling. You should be like, hey, this word is extreme. The answer just has a greater chance to be wrong. If an answer says that, all scholars believe that jazz is an American art form. Now we have 2 points of view. Both points of view say that jazz is American, but we don't know that all scholars believe it. All it would take is for one scholar to not believe it, and we don't know whether there's some one scholar sitting around who doesn't believe it, and that's certainly possible. So yes, an extreme statement, sometimes a superlative statement, right? It's just less likely for it to be true, just by the nature of how the statement is constructed. So I wouldn't say automatically eliminate, but your spidey senses should be alert for it. I do see some questions have come in on the question side as well. Can you please explain the last 3 lines? For E, we can negate it because the author never says that jazz is not American. Exactly. So for answer option E, right, we are eliminating E because the author is actually saying that jazz is American. She's not saying that jazz is not American. She, in fact, thinks that jazz is American just like the pure American people do. The only thing is that the pure American people, the reason why they think jazz is American is different from the reason why she thinks jazz is American. So that's why, right? Would C be incorrect if it said some scholars think rather than most scholars think? Absolutely, yes, it would be incorrect. All right. Let's take a look. Somebody is asked to explain the last 3 lines. Okay. So yes, you know, the last 3 lines are very complicated to understand, right? And essentially, what are they saying? There's 3 sentences here. And those 3 sentences are saying that, you know, the people who believe that jazz is purely American, the reasoning that they use to come to their conclusion is that jazz started in New Orleans. That's the first statement. That's pretty obvious. The second statement is that the irony, however, is that the essence of America lies in the plurality. So what she's saying is that the irony is that what makes something American is plurality. What makes something American is that it has lots of different influences. So to deny the rich and complex history of jazz. So essentially she's kind of suggesting that the pure American people are like, you know, they don't consider the rich history of jazz. They don't consider the West African origins or the European origins of jazz. And by denying this and by saying only that, oh, jazz is American because it started in America, they are denying the things about jazz that make jazz American in the first place. They're denying the influence that makes jazz American in the first place. Now, that's complicated. I would not expect you to understand that the first time around. I would not even recommend that you try to understand that the first time around. What I would recommend that you understand the first time around is that the people who are on Team Pure American have given a reason. But when we see the irony, however, we see that the author doesn't agree with this reason and that she is on the other side of the equation. She is on the side that plurality and convergence is what makes jazz American. The moment you have just that much information, you can answer these questions easily. And that's what matters, right? You just need enough information to answer questions, not information to help you understand the passage in its entirety. All right, let's take a look at question number 3. Right. Once again, I'm going to put the, just put a pause, give you a minute so that you can try to answer the question. If possible, please put it on the poll if you can see the poll. If not, wait a minute and put it at the end of a minute on the chat window. That way, you know, it will not get in the way of what everyone else can see as well. All right, you can put your answers in. I see some E's, I see some B's, I see some D's. More B's than anything else, but I do see enough of the E's and D's as well. That's interesting, right? Even for those of you who answered it on the poll, I do see some B's and D's as well. All right, so the right answer is B. Okay, so for the most of you, congratulations, right? But let's get at how we would answer such a question. So which of the following outlines the general structure? Now, if they ask you about the structure or the organization of the passage, they will want an answer that talks about what each paragraph does in one statement. Since this passage has 3 paragraphs, each option will have 3 statements, right? So that's something that we want to look out for, right? So, you know, since nobody has picked A or C, I'm not even going to get into A and C. Let's just look at B, D, and E. All right. Now, the thing that you want to remember is that if you think that an answer has a chance of being correct, do not eliminate it, right? you only eliminate an answer if you feel fairly certain that it is wrong. So let's take a look at B, then D, then E, and we will get to why B is correct. So B says, the first paragraph introduces two differing viewpoints on an issue. Cool. The second paragraph objectively presents relevant information. Objectively presents, I don't know if it's subjectively presenting, objectively presenting, but like I said, if I'm not sure, I will generally err on the side of caution and accept the answer. So I'll say, okay, objectively presents relevant information, just fine. The last one says the third paragraph describes the author's opinion. Yes, the author's opinion is there. We do find out in the third paragraph that the author's team Confluence, she even shits on the other opinion. She even says that the other opinion is not okay, right? Somebody also has put in C, so let's actually discuss C as well. So the first paragraph introduces two differing viewpoints on the issue, absolutely fine. The second paragraph gives a comprehensive history of the debate. The third paragraph describes one person's perspective on the debate. Third paragraph is described fine, first paragraph is described fine. But history of the debate. Okay, so the second paragraph gives us a history of jazz music, right? It gives us a history of the origins of jazz. The debate is jazz American because of Confluence, or is jazz American because of origin? Right? That's the debate. The debate is what makes jazz American, right? And that's what it is, right? Is jazz purely American, or is jazz American by Confluence? The debate, the history of the debate is not brought up anywhere here. If they'd said history of the debate, it would have been, oh, the first people to say that jazz was purely American said it in this year, or something like that. But they don't say that, and that's why it's not C. Let's take a look at D now. First paragraph presents two sides of an issue, absolutely fine. The second paragraph presents newly discovered information relative to the issue, relevant to the issue. So none of this information is newly discovered, right? You cannot, so it could be that it's newly discovered, but you'd have to know for sure that it's newly discovered in order to pick such an answer option. You cannot make an assumption to say that, yeah, it could be this. If an answer can be true, remember that it also can be false. You need to pick an answer that must be true on the basis of the information given. So therefore, D does not really work here. If we take a look at E, the first paragraph introduces a controversy. Okay, so you could say it's a controversy, right? As we always said, err on the side of caution, right? I don't think this is controversial, but there's two differing viewpoints. Yeah, let's say it's controversial. Why not? The second paragraph presents relevant background information. Absolutely, it does present relevant background information. The third paragraph settles the controversy. Now, if it was settling the controversy, we would know for sure which point of view is objectively correct. But really, we don't know that this point of view is objectively correct. We just know that this is what the author thinks. We just know what the author's position is. Remember this, right? That in American academic writing in general, passages will almost never use the first person. They'll never say, I believe that so-and-so. They will just state what they believe as a fact and then try to give information to back it up, right? So that's why we cannot say that it settles the controversy, because it does not give us an objectively correct answer as to what jazz is. It's just telling us what the author thinks jazz is. All right, let's take a look at the questions. What is the difference between two sides of an issue and two differing viewpoints? They are the same. It's just different ways of writing it so as to confuse you, right? So that is what the the problem is there. They have used the word argue. Where have they used the word argue? I don't see the word argue used here. So, so E would be correct if the author concluded that Confluence is the way. So if it is a scientific fact that, it could be that research findings can help us, show this data, which helps us conclude so and so, then E would be correct, because then it's settling the controversy. But the author concluding it for, like you can also make a conclusion based on your, any conclusion is to some extent based on your opinion. If the author gives a fact which can only lead to that conclusion, then you can say that it settles the controversy. But, like for example, I can give you some facts and, for example, I could say that inequality in India is rising. It is at the highest that it has ever been. And all economic programs that, have been instituted in this country, or all the economic thrust that's been introduced in this country in the last 30 years has consistently worsened the problem. My conclusion here would be that we have to reverse liberalization of the economy. Okay, like that would be my conclusion based on this. Now, we can't say that I've just given you some facts. The facts are true, and I can say that the facts point to that we should liberalize that we should reverse the liberalization. But we don't know that that's true or not. We don't know that I've settled it or not. That's my position on the issue. We don't actually know that it has been settled, right? And that's the thing, that the controversy was never settled, right? If we call this a controversy, it was never really settled. It is the author giving what her stance is, right? Even if the author says it like it is an objective fact, unless we have some, unless we have some research or evidence which says that it can only be that conclusion, it will always be somebody's opinion that is being stated, right? So that's what you want to look out for. All right, let's take a look at, wait, are there any other questions that have come up? Oh, I see question answer windows here. Okay, yeah, cool. So let's take a look now at the final question. Which of the following elements of jazz likely had its origin in West African musical traditions? Okay, so once again, right, I'm going to put, a minute or so, and I would like you to answer it after a minute. All right, you can start putting your answers in. I see some of you already have, but just start putting them in now. I saw some A's, a bunch of A's, okay? A bunch of E's, some D's, I saw C as well. Okay, cool, so they're pretty spread out here. There doesn't seem to be a common consensus. I think there's more A's than anything else, but I don't see a common consensus. Okay, that's interesting. All right, now, I did see somebody right before in the chat window say, you've made this passage very easy, that's great and all. Maybe we should have waited a little bit to figure that out, because the right answer here is actually answer option E. So let us now try and figure out what's going on over there, right? Like, why is it that so many of you were led down this path? So let's first start with the question. Which of the following elements of jazz most likely has its origin in West African music traditions? Great. Now, the first thing is this, right? So this is a good example of what your map can help you with, what your map will not help you with, or what you shouldn't try to make your map do. Because your map is not Superman, right? Your map is good for some things and not for others. So, I remember I said, don't write down what all the influences are, what are the European ones, what are the West African. Don't write down all of them. Your map should simply tell you that when you see a question like this, hey, I'm going to find the answer in the second passage, in the second paragraph, right? I know I'm going to find the answer over there. The other thing that you got to remember is this, right? That when you get something like this, right? Which of the following, and it's things that elements that might even be mentioned in the passage, right? What you want to look out for is that the right answer may not have the words that are used in the passage itself. In fact, the right answer will almost never have the words that are directly used in the passage. They will have something that communicates the meaning of what is used in the words. The other thing is this, right? You can also get a sense of what else to look for to help you eliminate answer options. They've asked us origin in West African musical traditions. So what has its origin in, like, if there's one correct answer that has, that's the origin in West African musical traditions, right? One West African musical tradition answer. If the other answers were just like circle, hexagon, triangle, they would be super easy, right? And we already saw that with the what is the second largest city in Slovenia question, right? If the other options have to be something that is wrong, but there's still a chance that you can pick them, right? And that's what happened with, you all picking A and D and some C's as well. So what are the wrong answers going to be? We have been given European and West African influences. There's a good chance going into the question itself that many of the wrong answers are going to be the European influences, right? Now all of this thought process, right? I know I said it out over the course of a minute and a half, but this is something that as you practice doing RC passages, you will gain an instinct for. You will have that sense of understanding that, oh, they're asking me about the West African ones. That means I'll see some I'll see the West African one and I'll see some European origins as well, right? And it can make your job a lot easier when it comes to elimination. So let's go through the options, right? The right answer is E, but let's see why A, B, C, D are incorrect. So A says the emphasis on a tonal harmonic structure. Okay, I don't remember seeing that at all, right? So if that is the case, I would simply not eliminate it because I know that I'll go back looking for it, in the passage somewhere. The use of the guitar as one of the primary rhythm instruments. Okay, not only did I not see that, I know that they never brought up guitars or that they brought up, any, like, what were the instruments other than these trumpet, trombone, saxophone, piano. I can see it here. I know that it's not B. That's the obvious wrong answer. C says melodic lines rooted in the Dorian scale. Okay, I do remember them talking about scale. And it says over here, jazz first played in New Orleans, borrowed heavily from the European musical scale and harmonic system. So that means that anything to do with the scale or the harmonic system, that would be a European influence. And that immediately tells us, okay, the emphasis on harmonic structure is wrong, not just because it's not a West African one. It's also wrong for that reason. But in order to find in order to make it possible to eliminate the answers easily, what you can see is that they have described, this harmony or whatever, but it's been described in the European, from the European point of view. So that means that we can go ahead and get rid of A, we can go ahead and get rid of C. I did see some people also pick D, the use of many instruments. Again, jazz ensembles were built predominantly on European instruments. So that means that the European influence was the one of using the instruments. Now, remember this, right? That an impromptu call and response. I saw somebody ask the question in the chat, right? And it was a good question. It was, what is it? Does improvise equal impromptu? Now, yes, it does. But I would say that even if you didn't know that, you should still get to answer option E. And here's why. We can see clearly how A, C, and D are European influences, and therefore they would not be the West African influences. So they are out. And we can see that B is not relevant in any way at all. Even if you're not sure what the answer itself means, you should still go ahead and pick it if you've eliminated everything else. So that's something that you definitely should look out to do, right? Now, if we see impromptu call and response between two instruments, okay, so it does say this here, right, that there's group participation and there's emphasis on improvisation. So, right, so it's like, people get together in a group and do like the improvs and stuff like that. I think it's similar to what we see in like Sufi music and all as well, right? So yeah, something of the sort. Okay, but anyway, the trap here is this. Between two instruments. So they spoke about instruments and you're like, oh, the European one is instruments. That could be, that's not ideal. Maybe that's why I should get rid of E. And therefore, ultimately then I'll go ahead with A, right? Because I didn't really see, it was harder to see this harmonic structure in the passage as easily, right? So that's the temptation. Remember this, right? The words used in the answer options are very, very directly a trap. The use of the answer options, the use of the wording in the answer options are designed to try and screw with you, right? To put it very bluntly. They will use the same words to say a different meaning, and they will use different words to match the meaning of what's been asked in a question. Always focus on elimination to ensure that you don't fall into this trap easily. And remember to always think about what does this sentence mean, not what are the words in this sentence. I know that sounds super, super simple, but our brains have done, like we have done reading comprehension passages, or you have done it for like 12, if not 15 years of your life. And the way that passages in school have taught you to do it has like hardwired your brain to look for the same words. So you actively have to try and avoid that, right? And that's ultimately what you have to look out for. All right, so let's see some of the final questions and then we can wrap things up. It's hard to pick up E if you've seen a jazz performance. Depends on what kind of jazz performance you've seen. The jazz performances that we see in orchestras are mostly, composed by and performed by, white or like upper class performers, and they don't do as much improvisation. But if you listen to like the jazz of like Miles Davis or something like that, there's a lot more improvisation, a lot more group participation. So, that's something to look out for. So ultimately, when we say impromptu call and response between the instruments part doesn't matter. What matters is that they're saying that there's some impromptu call and response. Call and response is like if you're at a concert and then somebody says a line and then, the line comes up again, but they offer you the mic. So, they, put the mic in your direction so that you all can answer. You all can say what that guy said previously, right? That's call and response essentially. It doesn't matter to know what the call and response is, but it does matter to see that, oh, there's some improvisation going on. But most of all, it matters to pick the answer by elimination. You do not need to be 100% certain of the meaning of what you've picked, and even less, you don't need to be 100% certain of the answer being correct itself or not. You just need to have some confidence that you have eliminated the right answers, or that you have eliminated the 4 wrong answers rather. So the second last line of para 2 would point to option D. Absolutely. The emphasis on improvisation in addition to group participation, right, is what leads there. The scatting doesn't actually tell us anything new. Passage talks about performance. Mimicking. So performance is not necessarily mimicking. The performance is how you, so it's the what are you going to play, which is European influence, and how do you perform that play, right? What is the energy that you put into it that is more performance, right? So that's why improvisation is impromptu, right? Something that happens in impromptu is improvisation, right? So ultimately, right, what we have to look out for is that, first of all, the other answers are wrong. Secondly, right, they did speak about improvisation and there's some improvisation happening. For that, the answer, like this call and response was never discussed, but it will not be. The right answer will not be something that is directly given to you, or very often, right? Sometimes it is, and then you should just go ahead and pick it. But very often the right answer will not be the words themselves, but rather what the words mean. An impromptu call and response is focusing on the fact that there was improvisation. And that truly is something that is a West African origin. All right, if you have any further questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box, and I'll keep answering whatever comes up, and then we can wrap things up because we have run way over time. So when I comprehend the passage myself, I have to read the lines again and again to understand it. After giving it a first read, it takes a lot of time. How can I work on that? Now, I'll tell you this, right? It's kind of like learning to swim. You have to let go of the fear of the water, and you have to let go of the fear of drowning a little bit in order to be able to push yourself to swim. What you should look to do is practice reading passages, but read them only once and see what information you can take away from that first reading. I know that it's not going to be a clear understanding, but that's okay. You don't need a fully clear understanding. All you need is that 50-50 kind of understanding, that sense of, oh, okay, passages about jazz and there are people who disagree and the authors picked a side. If you have that much understanding of the passage, that's actually not half bad. If you have that much understanding of the passage, you can still get 3 out of 4 of these questions right. So that's something that you should look out for. Difference between objectively and subjectively, right? So yeah, if it is objective, it is giving you facts. If it is subjective, it is giving you the author's belief. In the second paragraph, everything that's given is a fact. So I guess you could say it's objective, but that is a good example of, one of those things that I would not eliminate an answer on. I would not feel confident enough to say that this is definitely objective and not subjective. So, I would be a bit careful on that front. And I see these were questions that came before about answer option E. I think I've gotten into the depth of why answer option E works the way that it does. I have one other, actually 2 questions. Okay, so nice. One, how to manage a long passage towards the end. Don't read all of the sentences. Don't do it, right? You have to judge it based on the amount of time that you have left. If, let's say, question number 30 is when you start another RC passage, so you have 7 questions to go, you finish 29, 7 questions to go, and you only have, say, 8 minutes, right? Remember then that if your RC passage is going to be 3 questions long, you can't take more than 4 questions for it. if it's 4 minutes for it. If it's going to be 4 questions long, you can't take more than 5 minutes for it, because you do want to at least have a shot at answering the last few questions. Despite this, what you will note is that in any RC passage, even the relatively difficult ones, at least one question, if not 2 questions, are kind of easy. All you need to do is pick up on those very basic ideas, right? Read the passage once and pick up on the most basic ideas. Try to answer the questions with just that much information, right? You'll not get them all right, but if you're already towards the end of the test and you have a long RC passage and you're struggling with time management, this is the best optimization of what to do. The other question that I see is, I just want to get an overview of how to deal with passages, just want to answer correctly 3 out of 4. You know, it's not necessary for me to answer all 4 all the time. That's not a bad strategy, actually. If the passage is easier for you, of course, you should try to target getting all 4 right. But if you consistently get 3/4 of the questions correct in reading comprehension, in fact, if you consistently get 3/4 of the questions correct in the verbal section, you're looking at a score of like 35 or so. 35, maybe even 36. Which is great. I mean, with a 35 and a 49, you can get a 700. That should get you into like most universities out there, right? So all you need is that, right? All you need is that insurance that when you get a difficult passage, when you get a passage like this, for which the meaning can be kind of complicated, you shouldn't get nervous because of the meaning or because of what the passage is telling you about, because of the content of it. Just pick up on the gist, just look to make a map, and you will be able to zero in on as many answers as possible. All right, I'm a bit new to this, but how should I improve speed and accuracy? When I try to increase speed, I tend to lower the accuracy. Only work on one of them at a time. If you find that your speed is low, try and maintain the same accuracy, but with a higher speed, right? Just focus on one. Don't try to do them both together. Very difficult to do both together. You will naturally find a balance, you know, with the right speed and accuracy, right? So you can either first work on accuracy at the same speed, or work on increasing speed with the same accuracy, but just do one at a time. Lastly, I've noticed that generally when I make mistakes in consecutive RC questions in general. Okay, so it's like you make one mistake and then you make more mistakes on, you know, after that in the same passage. That is quite common if you have not correctly mapped out or understood the overall meaning of the passage. So really, that's why, you know, you want to focus on making that map. You want to focus on reading the passage from the point of view of the author, not from you learning something new, but you learning the author, that the author is trying to talk to you about. All right, so I don't see many other. Somebody said inference is equal to subjective. I'm just going to say that that's not necessarily true. And inference is something that you understand to be true on the basis of other information that is true. So it can be subjective sometimes, but it can also be objectively true. And inference is simply something that you know to be true on the basis of other information, so, and not direct information. So if 2 + 2 is 4 and 3 + 3 is 6, you can infer from that that 2 + 3 is 5, right? And that's an absolute fact. It's not subjective. But I never said that 2 + 3 is equal to 5, right? It was never said before. It's something that I understood because of the other facts. That's really what an inference is, you know, at the end of the day. All right, so we have run, you know, way over time. And, you know, I'm sure that many of you, I see that many of you have checked out, you know, naturally because it did run so long. But thank you so much to all of you who did stay on this long, right? Really appreciate it. And, you know, I really appreciate the effort that you all put in and the participation that all of you gave. This is one of the biggest webinars that we have ever had. So, you know, I understand that there might have been a few, you know, sort of technical glitches on the front of like how to organize the chat, how to organize the questions. I'm still working my way through that. So, you know, appreciate the patience on your part as well. You know, thank you all so much. One final question. Okay, I'll answer this. Why not? What to do if I run out of the practice material? Is LSAT a good practice material? For RC passages, it's not terrible. It's because with RC passages, you know, you can still practice reading and mapping the passage, and you can do that with LSAT passages just fine. But overall, you should try to stick to GMAT material, right? And you want to try and do GMAT. Like for RC, it's okay. You know, it's okay to try out the LSAT questions. Just remember that you're doing LSAT questions. For other parts of the test, like for CR, for example, don't do it. You're better off doing OG questions that you've done before as well, right? I am going to type in my email address because somebody has asked. So this is my email address. You can save it from the chat window. And take care, everyone. Have a great night. Have a great weekend. Right? See you all around wherever. If you join Crackverbal, right, you may see me teach you a session as well. Take care. Have a great night.